They called it a myth. That word stopped meaning anything the night the screaming started. I was there in the year 1908. I watched grown men freeze when something tall stepped out of the trees and did not hurry. It did not rush. It did not roar. It walked toward us like we were already decided. The jungle went silent, not because it was afraid, but because it knew what was coming. If you think stories like this are exaggerations, listen carefully. Because what attacked us was not an animal and not a legend. It was organized. It was hungry. And it knew how to wait. They thought it was a myth until the cannibal giants attacked. Before this continues, do this now. Subscribe, because stories like this disappear when they are ignored. Like the men who walked into the jungle and were never seen again. Like the names that never made it into the reports. And leave a comment telling me one thing. Do you think myths are created to entertain us or to warn us? Because by the end of this story, you are going to wish someone had warned you. We left the river settlement at dawn in the year 1908, moving inland under orders that were spoken carefully and written even more carefully, because the men who funded expeditions like ours preferred uncertainty to accountability and deniability to truth. I was assigned as recorder and translator, a role that sounded administrative until the jungle began stripping away everything that could be managed with ink and paper, leaving only breath, fear, and memory. There were 8 of us at the start, not counting the local carriers who refused to go farther than the first bend, where the water darkened and the air thickened as if the forest itself was drawing a boundary it did not want crossed. The guides did not argue with us, but they marked trees with quick, nervous cuts, not to lead us forward but to remind themselves where the river still existed, and even then they avoided looking directly into the undergrowth, as if something inside it might recognize attention as invitation. The first day passed without incident, although the silence pressed against us in a way that felt deliberate rather than natural, because the usual noise of insects and birds faded as we advanced, replaced by a dull absence that made every snapped twig sound louder than it should have. I noted this in my journal with language that tried to sound rational, even though the men had already begun speaking less and listening more, a habit learned only when survival replaces curiosity. By the second day, we found footprints that belonged to nothing we were prepared to name, impressions pressed deep into soil that should not have held weight so cleanly, shaped like human feet but stretched longer than any man's stride and set farther apart than any natural gait would allow. Our guide knelt beside them and said nothing for a long time, which frightened me more than if he had lied outright, because silence from a man who knew the forest meant that words had already failed him. When one of the younger men laughed nervously and suggested some elaborate hoax, the guide stood and walked away without responding, and no one followed him. That night we camped on raised ground and lit our fire lower than usual, not because we were instructed to, but because every man instinctively felt that light was something best kept small. I remember lying awake and realizing that the jungle had not gone quiet in the way animals do when danger approaches, but instead had gone attentive, as if the darkness itself were listening to our breathing and counting it. Somewhere beyond the edge of the firelight, something moved with weight and intention, not brushing through foliage but displacing it, and although I never saw a shape clearly enough to describe, I felt the certainty of being evaluated rather than stalked. The first man vanished before morning, taken without struggle and without sound, leaving behind only disturbed earth and a dragged line through the undergrowth that sank too deeply into the ground to belong to human hands. We searched briefly and without conviction, because every instinct warned us that following that trail would not lead to rescue, but to demonstration. When the guide returned from the tree line, his face was pale and rigid, and he told us that we had crossed into a place where men were not hunted for sport or territory, but gathered as resources. A distinction that settled heavily over us because it implied patience, planning, and repetition. It was then that I understood the truth we had refused to accept since leaving the river, which was that myths do not exist to exaggerate danger, but to compress it into a shape that can be remembered without being believed, and that we had walked willingly into a story that had already decided how many of us it would keep. By the time we resumed moving inland after the disappearance, the expedition had shifted from exploration to endurance, because every man now understood that our presence had been noticed long before we ever noticed signs of habitation. The forest began to reveal patterns that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. including trees stripped of bark far above a man's reach and pathways cleared with deliberate efficiency. Not the chaotic trails of animals, but wide corridors pressed flat by repeated passage. These were not marks of migration, but of routine, and that realization settled over us with a weight that made every step feel borrowed rather than chosen. Late in the afternoon, we reached a clearing that should not have existed because the vegetation parted too cleanly and the ground beneath our feet was compacted into a firmness shaped by repeated use. Along the perimeter stood wooden posts sunk deep into the earth, from which hung bundles of dark hair tied with vines that were still green, a detail that told me these displays were maintained rather than abandoned. I did not need anyone to explain what they were meant to signify, because symbols do not need translation when their purpose is intimidation, and I watched the faces of the men as they understood simultaneously that this was not decoration but communication. The first giant revealed itself without ceremony, stepping into view from behind a stand of trees, as if responding to our arrival rather than reacting to it, and the effect was immediate and devastating because nothing about its presence suggested aggression or urgency. It stood upright with proportions that mirrored our own but magnified beyond reason, shoulders broad enough to cast a shadow over the clearing, and limbs that moved with controlled efficiency rather than brute force. Its face was human enough to be recognizable, which was far worse than if it had been monstrous, because recognition invites comparison, and comparison strips away comforting distance. When it spoke, the sound was low and deliberate, not a shout or a roar, but a vocalization shaped by lungs built for speech rather than noise. And although none of us understood the language, the cadence carried intent clearly enough that meaning was unavoidable. It was not warning us away, and it was not threatening us directly, but acknowledging us as one acknowledges livestock brought into an enclosure, with a calm awareness of ownership rather than hostility. I felt my hands trembling as I wrote, because documenting something that should not exist creates a fracture between the mind and the body that no training prepares you for. More figures emerged from the tree line then, each larger than the last, moving with the confidence of beings who knew the terrain and the outcome long before we arrived, and I noticed that their attention focused not on our weapons but on our bodies, evaluating us with an efficiency that suggested experience rather than curiosity. One of them gestured toward the ground near the posts, and I understood with sickening clarity that these markers were not warnings to outsiders, but records of inventory, remnants of previous encounters preserved as proof of dominance. When the attack came, it did not begin with chaos but with selection, as one of the giants reached forward and seized a man near the edge of our formation, lifting him without strain and silencing him before he could scream. The sound that followed was not a cry but a sudden cessation of breath, a noise that ended too quickly and left behind a silence filled with understanding. Panic fractured our formation then, but panic was irrelevant against strength measured in systems rather than individuals, and every attempt at resistance only confirmed how thoroughly outmatched we were. As we fled blindly back toward the river, I understood that survival would not come from bravery or strategy, but from being overlooked, because predators that farm their prey do not pursue what they already know will return eventually. That knowledge did not comfort me, but it clarified the truth of what we had found, which was not a myth made flesh, but a functioning hierarchy that had thrived unnoticed. Because the jungle did not protect us from it, but protected it from us. We ran without direction after the first attack, driven less by strategy than by instinct, because once the illusion of control shattered, the jungle ceased to be terrain and became an enclosed mechanism designed to funnel us where it wanted us to go. Branches tore at our skin and roots caught our feet as we pushed through undergrowth that resisted us with deliberate density, and even as my lungs burned and my legs trembled, I was aware of a sound behind us that did not match our panic. The giants followed without urgency, their steps slow and heavy, not chasing but closing distance with the certainty of beings who knew escape was temporary. One of the men stumbled and fell, his rifle skidding uselessly across the ground, and before anyone could help him, a massive hand reached out from the foliage and lifted him upright as easily as one might lift a child. The man screamed then, not in fear but in protest, as if volume alone might restore fairness to the situation, and the scream ended abruptly when his body was struck against a tree with controlled force that spoke of familiarity rather than rage. The sound of bone breaking echoed through the forest, followed by a quiet that felt intentional, as if noise itself was being rationed. We reached the river at dusk, but the relief was brief, because the water that had once represented escape now reflected the towering shapes lining the opposite bank, their silhouettes distorted but unmistakable as they waded forward without hesitation. The river barely slowed them, reaching only to their thighs as they crossed with deliberate balance, and I realized then that our last remaining boundary had been an illusion created by our own limits rather than theirs. One of the giants carried something in its free hand, and when it raised it into the firelight, I saw the head of the man who had been taken earlier. His eyes open and glassy, his expression fixed in a state of disbelief that mirrored my own. The message was unmistakable, because it was not meant to frighten us into submission but to demonstrate inevitability, a concept far more terrifying because it removes hope rather than threatening it. We scattered along the riverbank, some plunging into the water while others ran parallel to it. And I chose neither option consciously but found myself pulled along by a smaller group that fled upstream, where the vegetation thickened and the ground rose unevenly into rocky outcrops. Behind us, the giants did not rush to pursue, instead dividing their attention with practiced efficiency, some cutting off escape routes while others waited to see which path would produce the most resistance. Night fell quickly, and with it came a shift in the forest that felt like permission granted rather than danger arriving, because the darkness favored those who already knew where to step. I remember hiding beneath a tangle of roots, my body pressed flat against damp earth, listening as voices passed nearby that were deep and calm, speaking to one another in a cadence that suggested coordination rather than excitement. At one point, a giant paused close enough that I could smell its breath, a heavy scent layered with smoke and old blood, and I understood with chilling clarity that it could see me, even though I could not see it. It moved on without acknowledging my presence, and that was when the worst realization settled over me, which was that survival in that moment had not been earned but deferred, and that whatever system governed their actions did not require every opportunity to be seized immediately. As the sounds faded into the distance, I lay there shaking, not from cold but from the awareness that we were no longer reacting to danger, but being processed by it. Morning did not bring clarity or safety, but it did reveal the aftermath of the night in a way that stripped away any remaining doubt about the nature of what we were facing. The riverbank was marked with deep impressions where bodies had been dragged rather than carried, grooves pressed into the soil that curved toward the interior, as if drawn by deliberate routes. We counted our numbers in silence, each absence weighing heavier than any wound, because the missing were not lost in confusion, but removed with intent, selected as one selects tools or supplies. We followed the river reluctantly, staying close to the water because it remained our only reference point in a landscape that had begun to feel actively misleading. And along the way we found evidence of habitation that grew more structured with every mile. Platforms were built high in the trees, connected by braided vines thick enough to bear immense weight, and from these elevated positions we felt watched in a way that transcended fear and settled into something closer to resignation. Every attempt to speak was met with sharp looks, because sound now felt like an offering rather than a necessity. By midday, we reached a rise overlooking a broad clearing, and from that vantage point we saw the village in full for the first time, its scale defying any explanation that would have allowed us to deny what we were witnessing. Structures built from massive logs stood in ordered clusters, their roofs layered carefully to channel rain, and between them moved figures whose size made the buildings themselves seem designed around their proportions rather than adapted from ours. Fires burned steadily, tended without haste, and racks of meat hung in the open air, their contents unmistakable even at a distance. As we watched, a group of giants gathered near one of the central fires, and one of them carried a familiar shape slung over its shoulder with casual balance. It took me a moment to recognize the clothing, because the body beneath it no longer held itself in a way that resembled life, and when understanding finally settled, I felt something inside me go still in a way that fear had not accomplished. The giants worked together methodically, not with cruelty but with efficiency, preparing flesh with practiced movements that spoke of routine rather than novelty. One of the men beside me began to weep quietly, his shoulders shaking as he watched the remains of someone he had shared meals with now being treated as sustenance. And I realized that this was the true horror of what we had found, which was not the violence itself, but the normalization of it. These beings did not revel in suffering or prolong it for pleasure, but integrated it into their daily lives, as one integrates farming or hunting, stripping it of drama and leaving only function. When one of the giants suddenly lifted its head and looked directly toward our hiding place, I felt exposed in a way that went beyond physical danger, because that gaze carried recognition rather than surprise. It knew we were there, and more importantly, it knew we were watching, and the slow tilt of its head conveyed something dangerously close to curiosity. The others followed its gaze, and for a moment, the entire village seemed to pause, as if considering whether the effort of retrieving us was worth expending now or later. That pause ended when one of them pointed in our direction and spoke, and the sound of that voice carried clearly across the clearing, deep and resonant, sealing our fate with a casual certainty that erased any remaining illusion of escape. We withdrew silently, retreating into the forest with the knowledge that we were no longer fugitives but inventory, and that the only question left unanswered was how long the giants intended to let us run before deciding it was time to harvest what remained. We did not speak as we moved, because language felt useless against a force that had already rewritten the rules, and because every word carried the risk of becoming a signal that told the forest exactly where we were. The guide led us away from the river and into higher ground, where the soil turned rockier and the trees spaced out enough to allow brief sightlines, although those sightlines did not comfort me, because they also meant we could be seen more easily by anything tall enough to look down through the canopy. The air grew hotter as the day progressed, and my mouth stayed dry no matter how carefully I rationed my water, because fear and exertion consumed whatever moisture my body tried to keep. By late afternoon, we reached a narrow ridge that overlooked a swampy basin, and the guide signaled us to stop with a hand that trembled despite his efforts to appear calm. He pointed to the basin and then to a line of trees beyond it where the ground rose again, and he told us that if we crossed quickly, we might reach a series of stone shelves that could not be approached easily from below. One of the men asked why he believed stone would matter to creatures that walked through rivers, like they were shallow ditches, and the guide did not answer directly, because his belief was not built on certainty, but on desperate pattern recognition. He said only that the giants preferred routes that protected their joints and their weight, and that steep rock made even the strongest body cautious, not because it could not climb, but because slipping was an injury that time would not forgive. We began crossing the basin in a staggered line, stepping from root to root and testing each patch of ground before placing our weight, because the mud sucked at our boots and threatened to claim us with the slow patience of something that never needed to hurry. Halfway across, I heard a low sound behind us that was not the snap of a branch or the call of a bird, but a deep rhythmic exhale that felt coordinated, like breathing used as a signal. My skin tightened along my arms as if the sound carried physical pressure, and I turned my head just enough to see movement at the edge of the swamp, where silhouettes stood between trunks in a formation that made my stomach twist. They did not charge. They did not shout. They waited until we were committed to the basin, until turning back would slow us more than continuing forward, and then they stepped into the mud as if it were ordinary ground. Their weight should have sunk them, but they moved with deliberate foot placement, placing each step where roots and packed earth could bear them, and that simple competence was the most terrifying thing I had seen, because it meant their knowledge of the terrain exceeded ours in every possible way. One of them raised an arm and pointed, and the others angled their bodies to flank, not to chase but to guide. Panic rippled through our line, but panic was a private emotion that accomplished nothing, because there was no open ground to sprint across, and no cover dense enough to conceal us from bodies that could see over undergrowth. One man slipped and went down hard, and the sound of his fall was drowned by the sudden slap of something large moving through water nearby. I saw a giant's hand reach forward, not grabbing wildly, but choosing the man by the shoulder and lifting him slowly, as if confirming he was worth taking. The man's mouth opened in a scream that came out thin and strangled, and then the scream cut off as the giant's other hand closed around his face with a gentle pressure that was more intimate than violence. We reached the far side of the basin with our lungs burning and our hands shaking, and we climbed toward the stone shelves the guide had promised, scrambling over rock that scraped our palms and tore fabric at our knees. Behind us, the giants did not rush to keep pace, because they did not need to, and that knowledge pressed into my mind like a thumb against a bruise. They moved with the certainty of owners who let livestock run inside fenced property, because the fences were not always visible to the animals. When we finally reached the first shelf and looked down, we saw them below, standing at the base of the ridge, watching without anger, and the guide whispered that they were waiting for night, because night would make the ridge ours to fear rather than theirs. Night came with the speed it always comes in that region, falling like a curtain that turned familiar shapes into traps. And when darkness settled fully, our small ledge felt less like a refuge and more like a shallow bowl with one narrow exit. We huddled against the rock face and kept our fire unlit, because the guide insisted that light would not protect us, and because we had already seen how easily the giants navigated without it. In the absence of flame, the forest became a layered volume of sound, and every sound carried meaning that I could not interpret, which made my mind search for patterns until it exhausted itself. At first, there was only the ordinary noise of distant insects, then a gradual thinning of that noise, as if the smaller life forms sensed something approaching and chose silence over mistake. The guide leaned close to the rock and placed his ear against it, listening not to the air but to the vibration of the ground, and when he lifted his head, I could see in his eyes that he had heard what he feared. He told us that the giants were spreading out, positioning themselves where they could cut off our descent, and he said it with the calm of a man who has exhausted panic and entered the colder stage that comes after, where acceptance masquerades as clarity. I kept my journal close, not because writing could save me, but because the act of recording gave my mind a task that resisted collapse. I wrote about the basin, about the precision of their steps, about the way they chose a man without hurry, and as I wrote, I realized something that made my stomach tighten even more. They were not improvising. They were repeating. Their movements felt like a method practiced many times with many groups, refined until it produced the same result, and that was why the myth had survived, because myths persist when the pattern continues, and the survivors are too few or too ashamed to speak clearly. Sometime after midnight, we heard voices below. They were low and deliberate, and although I could not understand the words, I recognized the rhythm of coordination, the same cadence men use when they divide work, when they assign roles, when they confirm readiness. One of the men beside me began to whisper a prayer, and another tried to silence him with a hand over his mouth, because even a whisper felt loud when fear made every sense hyperactive. The guide did not intervene, because he knew it was already too late to hide by sound alone. A shape rose into view at the edge of our ledge, not climbing like a man would climb, but pulling itself upward with a controlled strength that made the rock seem irrelevant. I saw a hand first, then an arm, then the top of a head that was too large for the silhouette my mind wanted to accept. It moved slowly, pausing as if listening, and then it lifted its face into the faint light of the moon, revealing eyes that were not wild or frantic but steady and focused. The giant looked at us the way a butcher looks at a row of animals, not with hatred but with assessment. And it was that lack of emotion that made my chest tighten until breathing became difficult. The guide raised his weapon, but his hands shook, and before he could act, another giant appeared from a different angle, climbing with the same calm precision, and then another, until the ledge was no longer a single approach, but a perimeter being breached. One of our men fired, and the shot cracked through the night like a breaking branch. And for a brief moment I felt the childish hope that loudness could equal power. The hope died when the bullet struck flesh and the giant barely reacted, turning its head as if annoyed by an insect rather than wounded by metal. They came onto the ledge then, not sprinting but walking, forcing us backward until our shoulders pressed against the rock face and our feet searched for space that did not exist. One giant reached forward and seized the nearest man by the collar, lifting him so easily that the man's legs dangled and kicked uselessly. The man tried to stab with a knife, and the knife glanced off thick muscle, and then the giant opened its mouth and bit into the man's shoulder with a slow pressure that made the man's scream become something animal and incoherent. The sound of tearing flesh filled the dark, and I felt my mind recoil from it, but my eyes did not look away, because horror has a way of forcing witness. The guide shouted for us to move along the narrow crack at the far end of the ledge, a slit between rocks that led downward into a shadowed chute, and we obeyed because obedience was the only remaining form of choice. As I squeezed into that crack, scraping my ribs and shoulders on stone, I heard the giants behind us shifting their weight, and I realized they were letting us go again. Not because they could not take all of us at once, but because they did not want to. They were shaping the survivors, training the story, ensuring that the ones who lived would spread fear ahead of them, because fear clears routes better than violence ever could. We slid down the rock chute in darkness that felt thick enough to touch, and every inch of stone scraped skin from our shoulders and forearms, as if the ridge itself demanded payment for allowing us through. I remember the sound of our breathing more than the sound of pursuit, because the giants did not need to crash through brush to announce themselves, and because silence from something that large is never comfort, it is confidence. The chute opened into a narrow ravine, where the air smelled of wet mineral and decaying leaves, and when my boots finally hit soft ground, I fell forward on my hands and knees, shaking with exhaustion that bordered on collapse. The guide forced us upright and pointed downslope, insisting that we move before our bodies convinced us to stop, because stopping was when terror became thinking, and thinking was when people made fatal bargains with hope. We moved in single file through the ravine, guided by moonlight that barely reached the floor, and the men behind me kept glancing over their shoulders as if sight alone could protect them. I kept my journal pressed against my chest under my shirt, not because I believed it would survive water or blood, but because the weight of it reminded me that I was still a person, and not simply prey being managed. We emerged near dawn into a stand of trees that grew crooked and sparse on higher ground, and from there we could see the basin we had crossed the previous day, now lying still and gray under a thin mist. The guide counted us with his lips pressed tight, then counted again as if arithmetic could reverse what had happened in the dark. We were fewer, and the absence of names felt like missing teeth in a mouth, a gap the tongue cannot stop touching. One man asked whether the giants had followed, and the guide said nothing until he crouched and placed his palm on the ground, then lifted it and sniffed as if the earth itself carried scent. He said that they were moving, but not quickly, and that we should treat that slowness as a trap rather than mercy. By mid-morning we found an abandoned camp, a ring of stones blackened by old fires and a rough shelter frame still lashed together with vine, and what made my stomach tighten was not the existence of another camp, but the condition it was in. The pots were overturned as if kicked aside, and the ground inside the ring was scored with deep grooves, the kind made when something heavy is dragged repeatedly. We found a strip of cloth snagged on a thorn, stained dark and stiff, and one of the men recognized the pattern as belonging to a supply company that had gone missing months earlier. The guide told us to leave immediately, but my eyes were caught by a line of posts at the far edge of the clearing, half hidden by foliage, each bearing a bundle of hair tied in a familiar knot. The posts were not random, and the knots were not careless, which meant this was not merely a warning to us, but a mark that said the area was claimed and used. I realized then that the giants were not guarding a single village, but managing a territory, and that we were moving inside a system that had boundaries, routes, and rules. The myth had survived because the system did not need to eliminate everyone, only enough people to make the rest of the region obey the silence. We left the clearing and pushed toward what we believed was the direction of the river, but the jungle began to distort our sense of distance, because every slope looked similar and every cluster of trees formed false landmarks. The guide stopped suddenly in the afternoon and raised his hand, and in the quiet that followed I heard something that did not belong to wind or insects. It was a low, rhythmic strike, like a club tapped against a trunk, repeated at steady intervals, and the sound came from our left, then from our right, then from behind, as if it had moved without traveling. The guide whispered that they were communicating, and he told us that the taps were not signals of location but instructions, a way of directing others through the forest. One of the men began to shake and said that we needed to run. But the guide said running would only exhaust us and make us noisy, and noise made selection easier. We continued at a controlled pace, but my heart raced as if I were sprinting, because the tapping began to sync with our steps, as if something was matching us, measuring us, and adjusting its path to intersect ours at the most efficient point. Near evening, the ravine widened into a low valley where the trees opened enough to reveal a broad path pressed into the earth, too wide for men, and too deep to be animal. The guide stared at it with a look that was almost grief, and he said we had found one of their routes, which meant we had not escaped their territory at all. We had been guided into the corridor that belonged to them, and as the light began to fade, I understood we were not being hunted in the way stories describe, but herded, moved from one holding area to the next, until the moment they decided it was time to stop letting the survivors teach themselves fear. We stood at the edge of the pressed corridor and hesitated, because crossing it felt like stepping onto a stage where the audience was hidden but guaranteed. The ground was compacted into a hard brown strip, the surface scarred with long, shallow grooves that suggested heavy feet and dragged weight, and the trees on either side leaned inward, as if the path had been carved by force rather than formed by chance. The guide motioned for us to move parallel to it rather than across it, and we did so with our bodies hunched and our heads angled toward the tree line, scanning for movement that our eyes could not confidently identify. We found higher ground again and made a cold camp without fire, huddling close beneath a tangle of roots that formed a shallow overhang. In the absence of flame, every face looked ghostly, and every blink felt like a risk, because closing your eyes means surrendering the only warning you might get. The guide told us to sleep in turns, but no one truly slept, because the mind cannot rest when it believes its body has become an item on a list. I heard the corridor below us through the night, not as footsteps but as occasional deep impacts that sounded like something heavy being set down and lifted again, the way crates are handled at a dock. Just before dawn, the forest went quiet in a way that felt decisive, and the guide's posture changed as if he had received an instruction through the ground itself. He whispered that they were close, and he told us that if we heard a certain sound, we were to run uphill without stopping, even if we could not see what chased us. One man asked what sound, and the guide answered that it would be a low breath pushed through a wide chest, a sound that could travel without revealing precise location. The guide said that sound was how they coordinated the final approach, and I felt my throat tighten because he spoke with the certainty of a man repeating something he had learned from others who did not survive long enough to publish it. The sound came an hour later, drifting up the slope like fog, and when it reached us it felt less like noise and more like pressure. The men around me stiffened, and someone whispered a prayer, and then we heard the taps again, but closer, and then the slow, deliberate cracking of branches that were not snapped by carelessness, but by weight that did not need to avoid anything. The guide motioned for us to move, and we climbed toward a ridge line where the trees thinned, but as we climbed we realized the ridge was not empty. Shapes stood along it at intervals, silhouettes too tall to be human, positioned like guards. For a moment I could not accept what I was seeing because my mind insisted there had to be a gap, a mistake, a blind spot we could exploit. But the spacing of those figures was deliberate and even, forming a wall not made of wood or stone but of bodies. One giant stepped forward and lowered its head slightly, as if studying our faces, and I saw scars on its shoulders that looked pale in the weak light, lines that suggested repeated injury and survival. It carried a club that looked like a section of tree trunk stripped of bark, and the club rested against its leg with the casual posture of a tool rather than a weapon. Another giant appeared behind us, then another, and the realization hit with a sick clarity that the corridor below was not merely a route, it was a funnel, and we had been driven upward into a pen. The guide raised his weapon and did not fire, because he understood that bullets and bravery were not the decisive elements here. The decisive element was control of space, and they had it completely. One of the giants spoke, its voice deep and slow, and although I did not understand the words, I recognized the tone of ownership. The man closest to me took a step backward and bumped into another, and that small collision began a chain reaction of panic, bodies shifting in tight space, and panic is loud even when no one screams. The first grab happened in the middle of that disorder, because selection thrives on confusion. A giant reached into the cluster and seized a man by the waist, lifting him cleanly off the ground, and the man's legs kicked uselessly as he cried out in a voice that cracked into helplessness. The giant did not strike him immediately, but held him up as if inspecting his size, and then turned slightly to show him to the others, a gesture that resembled sharing rather than threat. Another giant stepped closer and placed its hand on the man's shoulder with a slow pressure that made the man stiffen, and then the second giant leaned in and bit into the side of his neck with a controlled motion that looked practiced. The scream that followed was not long, because blood loss is efficient when the method has been refined, and the moment the body went slack, the giant lowered it carefully as if protecting the meat from bruising. I felt something cold bloom in my stomach, because the act was not performed in rage or chaos, but with the measured care of preparation. The guide shouted for us to break left toward a narrow gap between two rocks, and we lunged as one, forcing ourselves through the opening with elbows and shoulders, scraping skin and tearing cloth. Not because the gap was truly open, but because the giants allowed it to remain open for a reason. As we squeezed through, I heard the giants behind us shifting, not rushing to stop us, but adjusting their positions to keep the funnel working, and I understood then that they were not trying to end the chase quickly. They were teaching the survivors a lesson that would travel farther than any body could, because fear spreads faster than boats and deeper than maps, and a territory ruled by fear requires fewer kills to remain fed. We forced ourselves through the narrow rock gap and spilled into a steep decline where the ground dropped away in uneven shelves, and for several minutes we moved in a half-controlled slide, catching ourselves on roots and jagged stone while the forest spun in my peripheral vision. The air changed as we descended, growing cooler and wetter, and I could smell moving water somewhere below us. A scent that should have offered hope, but instead sharpened my fear, because water had already proven itself to be a false boundary. The guide kept urging us forward with a low voice, insisting that speed mattered now, because the giants had allowed us the illusion of escape long enough, and once the lesson had been delivered, efficiency would return. At the bottom of the slope we reached a narrow stream that cut through the forest like a thin vein, and we followed it because following water is what men do when they are lost and trying to behave rationally. The stream widened as it ran, feeding into a shallow channel where stones formed a broken path across, and we crossed quickly, using the rocks as stepping points, our boots slipping on algae and wet moss. One man fell and caught himself, soaking his clothes and gasping in panic, and the sound of his breath seemed to fill the trees, because fear makes normal noise feel like a beacon. We climbed again, pushing through brush so dense it felt woven, and the guide began marking trees with shallow cuts as we moved, a habit that had returned, not because he believed we would find our way back, but because he wanted to leave evidence that might outlive us. I watched his blade carve the bark, and I understood that his mind had shifted from survival to testimony, and that shift terrified me, because men do not become record keepers when they believe rescue is possible. The others moved with a frantic determination, but even their determination had a hollow quality now, because the forest had taught us that effort does not equal outcome. In late afternoon, we heard the deep exhale again, closer than it had ever been, and it came from more than one direction, overlapping and repeating like a call and response. The guide froze and pressed his palm to the ground, then lifted it and said that they were surrounding us, not to chase but to corral. He told us that if we kept moving along the stream's direction, it would lead us toward a gorge where the water ran faster and the terrain broke into stone, and he believed that the giants would hesitate there because their weight and their trophies would not travel easily across slick rock. We reached the gorge near dusk, and the sight of it made my stomach tighten because the river below was not a calm channel, but a violent run of pale water forced through a narrow chute, churning against boulders like fists. The sound was constant and deafening, and mist rose in a cold veil that clung to our skin. The guide pointed to a narrow shelf path that ran along the gorge wall, and we moved onto it one by one, hugging stone that was wet and slick, our fingers searching for cracks and holds. Behind us, the forest cracked and shifted with heavy movement, and then the first giant appeared at the edge of the trees, standing high enough that its head rose above the canopy line as if the jungle was built to accommodate it. Another emerged beside it, then another, and their silhouettes looked even more impossible against the fading light. They did not charge onto the shelf, but they approached the edge, slowly, and stared down at us with an expression that seemed almost thoughtful. One of them carried a bundle slung over its shoulder, and when it adjusted the weight, an arm fell limp, revealing a hand that looked human in shape, but gray in death. The guide whispered that they were deciding whether the gorge was worth the effort, and the idea of being the subject of that decision made my mouth go dry. A man behind me began sobbing quietly, and his sobs turned into words, and the guide snapped at him to stop speaking, because speech was weakness now. The sobbing man did not stop, because fear has its own momentum, and then I heard a deep, low laugh from above, brief and controlled, as if the sound was not amusement but confirmation. The giants had learned something from our reactions, and they liked the lesson. One giant crouched, placing its massive hand on the rock, testing it, and then it began descending, not onto the narrow shelf, but onto the gorge wall itself, moving with a patient strength that ignored the geometry our minds depended on. It did not slip, and it did not hurry, and each slow movement down the stone felt like a promise being fulfilled. We moved faster along the shelf, scraping our hands raw and forcing our bodies through turns where the path narrowed into a strip no wider than a boot. At a bend ahead, the shelf ended at a point where the wall dropped, and the only continuation was a short leap to another ledge. The guide reached it first and stopped, measuring the distance with his eyes, then turning back toward us with a face that had gone pale. He told us that we would have to jump one by one, and he told us that if we waited too long, the giant descending behind us would reach the shelf and start taking us in order. The first man jumped and barely made it, landing hard and rolling, then scrambling to his feet with a cry of pain. The second man hesitated, and in that hesitation I saw the same pattern repeat, the moment when fear becomes a decision point, and decisions are where predators intervene. The guide shouted at him to jump, and the man finally leapt, catching the far ledge with his fingertips, then hauling himself up with desperate strength. When my turn came, I looked down at the water and saw the rocks waiting like teeth, and I understood that survival had narrowed to two unacceptable options, and that was the purest form of horror, because it leaves you no choice that feels like living. I jumped. I landed on the far ledge with my knees absorbing the impact in a burst of pain that made my vision flash white, and for a moment I could not breathe properly because the air felt trapped behind my ribs. The man who had jumped before me grabbed my arm and hauled me upright, and we stumbled forward along the new ledge as if movement itself could keep death from catching up. The shelf here was narrower and more broken, with sections where rock had crumbled away leaving gaps that forced us to crawl, and the gorge wall pressed close on one side while the roaring river dropped away on the other, offering no space for hesitation. Behind us, the giant reached the first shelf and stepped onto it with the calm confidence of a being that did not experience vertigo, and as it advanced, the shelf creaked under its weight and shed small stones into the water below. The sound of those stones hitting the river was swallowed instantly, which made the giant's presence feel even more unreal, because something that massive should have announced itself, yet it moved like a shadow with gravity. Another giant appeared above, watching, and then a third, and I realized that they were not acting in desperation to catch us, but in patience to demonstrate that there was nowhere terrain could truly protect us. The guide urged us toward an opening in the rock, where the gorge narrowed into a darker corridor, and when we reached it, we saw a natural arch that formed a partial tunnel, the stone above wet and streaked with mineral deposits that glistened faintly in the dying light. The river thundered through the tunnel beneath, creating a constant vibration that traveled through the rock and into our bones. The guide said the tunnel would force the giant to slow because the ceiling dropped and the footing became unpredictable. And for the first time in days I heard hope in his voice, thin and fragile but present. We entered the tunnel and moved single file, our hands sliding along wet stone, our bodies pressed close to the wall to avoid being pulled by spray. My journal was soaked through, the pages heavy and warped, and I felt an irrational grief at the idea of losing the record, because the record was the only thing that made the horror feel like something other than madness. The tunnel curved, and the light behind us dimmed until we were inside a gray half-darkness, and in that half-darkness every sound became magnified, including our breathing, our slipping boots, and the constant roar that turned individual noises into indistinct panic. Halfway through the tunnel, we reached a section where the wall opened briefly into a small alcove, and in that alcove we saw bones arranged in a pattern that was too deliberate to be accidental. They were not scattered like remains caught by water, but placed in parallel lines and circles, as if someone had used the alcove as a marker, a sign, or an altar. A skull sat at the center, and even in the dim light I could see it was human. The sight froze us for a heartbeat, and that heartbeat was all the tunnel needed to punish us. The giant entered the tunnel behind us. We did not see it at first, but we felt it, because the vibration of its steps changed the vibration of the river, adding a heavier rhythm that traveled through the stone. Then we heard the low exhale, closer than ever, filling the tunnel like fog. The guide whispered for us to keep moving, and we obeyed, but our progress slowed because fear makes bodies clumsy, and because the tunnel narrowed where the wall bulged inward, forcing us to squeeze through one at a time. The man behind me was pulled backward suddenly with such force that his hands scraped skin from the rock, and when I turned, I saw the giant's hand around his ankle, fingers closing with a gentle certainty. The man screamed and tried to kick free, but the giant lifted his leg higher, dragging him toward the darkness behind, and the scream shifted into a hoarse, pleading noise that did not sound human anymore. The guide tried to reach him, but another giant silhouette appeared at the tunnel entrance, blocking any rescue. And the guide stopped because he understood the system again. They did not need to take all of us. They needed to take enough of us to keep the lesson sharp. We pushed onward, leaving the man's screams behind until the roar of the river drowned them, and when we emerged from the far end of the tunnel, night had fallen fully. The world outside was black, except for faint moonlight on the water, and the air felt colder and more open. The guide pointed to a narrow strip of land downstream where the gorge widened slightly, and he told us we had one chance left, because beyond that point the terrain would flatten and the giants would regain full advantage. He said we would have to enter the water, not to swim along the surface, but to let the current carry us through the dangerous run and out into a wider channel where we might find cover. I looked at the river and felt my stomach drop, because the water was not an escape, it was a blade. And yet it was the only blade that might cut us free. The guide said we would go one by one, because if we hesitated, the giants would emerge from the tunnel and take us at the mouth like fish pulled from a net. The first man stepped in and vanished immediately, swallowed by spray and darkness. The second followed, and then the guide turned to me and told me that if I survived, I must write the truth plainly and leave it where someone would find it. Then he stepped into the river, and I stepped in after him. The river took me the moment my feet lost contact with the stone, pulling my body into a force that did not care about intention or fear, only mass and direction. The current slammed me against rock and spun me under, and water filled my mouth and nose so completely that the instinct to breathe became a betrayal I had to fight. I remember flashes rather than sequence, the pale blur of moonlight on spray, the hammering impact of my shoulder against stone, the sound of the river tearing itself apart around me as if it wanted to erase everything that entered it. When I surfaced, it was by accident rather than strength, my hands clawing at anything solid until they closed around a branch that bent but did not break. I held on until my fingers went numb and my arms shook uncontrollably, and when the current finally eased enough for me to drag myself onto a strip of mud and stone, I lay there retching water and blood, staring into darkness that felt suddenly empty. The gorge behind me roared without pause, but above that sound there was nothing else, no footsteps, no breath, no voices, and that absence terrified me more than pursuit, because it meant the giants had decided the river had done enough of their work for them. I did not know how long I lay there before I forced myself to move, because stillness in that place felt like an invitation rather than rest. My body protested every attempt to stand, but pain was something I could measure, and measured things felt safer than the unknown. I moved downstream, keeping the sound of the river close because it was the only constant left, and I followed it until the forest thinned and the ground leveled into a narrow bank choked with reeds. Dawn came without color, a gray light that revealed the damage my body had taken in quiet detail. Torn skin, bruises blooming dark along my ribs, and a shoulder that burned with every movement. I did not see the guide again, and I did not see any of the others, and I understood that the river had decided who would carry the story forward. That knowledge felt heavier than grief, because it came with responsibility rather than release. I traveled for days without direction, guided only by water and the instinct to avoid places where the forest went quiet too quickly. Once, I smelled the familiar heavy scent of smoke and old blood, faint but unmistakable, and I dropped to the ground and waited until it faded, my heart pounding as if it might give me away. Another time, I found markings on trees that matched the guide's cuts, and I followed them until they ended abruptly, snapped off by deeper gouges that told me who had found them first. When I finally reached a trading outpost, the men who saw me recoiled before helping, crossing themselves and asking what had happened upriver. I told them only that the route was closed and that no amount of payment would reopen it, and the look in their eyes told me they understood more than they asked. They gave me water and food and passage downriver without questions, and I did not volunteer answers, because some truths cannot be explained, only warned around. Months later, when I stood before men who preferred maps to memories, I gave them facts that could be filed and names that could be buried. I spoke of terrain and weather and hostile conditions, and I watched relief pass through their faces as they wrote words that protected them from imagining anything larger. I did not mention cannibal giants. I did not describe the village or the posts or the systems of selection. I did not tell them how organized it was, because organization implies permanence, and permanence demands response. I wrote the rest privately. I wrote about the myth and how it functioned not as a story to scare children, but as a fence that kept outsiders moving elsewhere. I wrote about the way fear spreads faster than boats and deeper than maps. I wrote about the men who were taken and the way they were handled with care rather than rage, because that detail mattered most of all. When I finished, I sealed the pages and left them where they would only be opened if someone else came back with the same story, because repetition is the only proof that survives denial. They thought it was a myth until cannibal giants attacked, and the jungle kept the rest. If you are still listening, do not dismiss this as fiction meant to entertain you in the dark. Subscribe now, because stories like this are buried when too many people look away, like the roots that vanish from maps, like the names that never return. And leave a comment telling me this. Do you think myths exist to scare us or to keep us alive? Then tell me what kind of story you want to hear next. Do you want another lost expedition? A creature that was documented and then erased? Or a place on the map that everyone learned to avoid without ever explaining why? Because the next story is already waiting. The only question is which one you want uncovered.